Welcome, everyone, to the Texas Academic Decathlon Lit Talk. For the summer, this is our second time we've met together, and next week will be our last. Thank you for logging on and watching this talk about Lathe of Heaven. We're going to wrap up the last half of the book here and talk about kind of how it ends and all the weirdness that happens and the dystopian weirdness that happens in the novel. And so hopefully the chat works. I think I fixed that bug that was wrong last week. So right off the bat, go ahead, and you do have to be a subscriber to participate in the chat. But if you are listening to us, go ahead and let us know what team you're with. I always enjoy hearing where everybody's from around the state. Hope your summers are going very well. We are about, I would say, probably just a couple of weeks away for some of you from the first start of school when those day-to-day ACTEC practices will start. So good luck with those. I'm sure some of you are already meeting, spending time with coaches and your teammates. And I am so very glad that you decided to do ACTEC, and it's going to be a great season. We've got a great topic this year, great novels, great music, great art. So looking forward to a very good year. So as we go through here, just go ahead and whenever you can, once you've subscribed and a few minutes requirement to subscribe and a comment passes, go ahead and just pop in your team name in there. I do enjoy seeing what teams you guys are from. I probably know a good portion of your coaches or have met them at some point. And this week, I also, there were no car accidents this week, so I actually had my book in my hands this week, so be able to refer to page numbers as we go through this, talk about the last of the book. So first off, I'd like to talk about any questions you have from first. Maybe if you were watching last week and you had a question or something that was confusing in the first part of the book that you would like to ask me about, feel free to go ahead and pop that into the chat. Or you can either reply to one of the posts on Twitter, I'll see that pretty quickly, or Instagram, because I have that pulled up as well. And I guess if you weren't here last week, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jared Stewart. I help out with all the social media for Texas Academic Decathlon. I also work on a PhD in English. And so Lathe of Heaven is one of the books that is going to be part of my dissertation reading list. So it's kind of killed two birds with one stone for me. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it in chat. A little bit of time at the end for questions too if we don't get to it just now. Or post it on Instagram in a response to the latest post or on Twitter. And I'll answer your question, talk about it, kind of help you figure things out in the book, because that is the point of this. Next week, we'll be diving into the Orwell short story. Normally we just do novels, but someone asked to go into some of the short selections. And because this novel is relatively short with only 11 chapters, I figured we could do that. So I don't see any questions in the chat. From another account that I've logged into, it looks like the chat is working, but if it is not for people, please let me know. I will do my best. Creek is here. I don't know which creek that is. Timber Creek. I think of the other creek schools that I know. All right, well, we'll get back to questions later. So let's talk about where we left off last time. Last time, when we finished chapter 5, we know that Dr. Haber is using George to change reality. That he started off slow, but has started to, quote unquote, improve things more and more as we've gone through. And we went through the part of where George is suspicious. He thinks, does he know? Does he not know? I don't understand. Uh, and so, I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Um, George starts to figure it out right there at the end of chapter 5. So, yes, he knows. Yes. And then we also get the introduction of Heather, and she sees reality changing right there at the very end of chapter 5. So by the time we get to chapter 5, the first 5 chapters basically establish this dystopian world that he lives in. We establish the problem of his dreams changing reality. We are introduced to essentially the bad guy of the novel, Dr. Haber, the mad scientist, quote unquote, that we'll actually deal with today, the concept of mad scientist. And we're introduced to the love interest. Uh, that is also kind of the third perspective that kind of verifies George's perspective of what's going on to some extent. And so the big question becomes are the changes good, bad, or neutral? So if we get to by chapter 5, you can look at this and go, doctors changing things. Are they changes for the good? Are they changes for the bad? Or are they just kind of neutral? Which is going to be a question as we go through this. I'm like, oh, well, he seems to be doing some good things here. The environment there, obviously, the dreaming 6 billion people off the planet, that's not a good thing. But the other parts of it, like, okay, well, he seems like he's trying to help humanity. And I guess that's part of kind of we understand the motivation of Dr. Haber is that he is trying to fix things, but it clearly goes off the tracks after chapter 5. So, and good, it's Clear Creek. We did not think Clear Creek. So very happy Clear Creek is here. Glad to see somebody from Dobie is here. Love Dobie. So that's where we left off last week. So let's dive off into chapter 6. Turning the book to chapter 6 here. So chapter 6, George is beginning to resist. That's essentially chapter 6. George begins to resist the idea that, and by the way, as I go through these chapters, if you have any questions or anything about these chapters, please feel free to type something in the chat. I'll be happy to address them as I go. So George begins to resist. Someone just asked, I guess from what I just talked about, there's a bit of a delay between when the chat pops up and when I see them. Was Heather Laloche intended as the love interest when the author started the novel, or did the author make her a love interest later in the novel because of 1970s demand for romance in literature? I do. I will admit to not reading the guide word for word over there, so I'm not sure if the guide covers that. So I'm not really sure. And really, even in the beginning of it, she's not really a love interest, but she is someone that potentially cares for George, even if we consider it kind of a friendly love. There is someone with kind of a more of emotional attachment to this. You're right. She doesn't start off as a love interest in the very beginning, although she does admit in the very first chapter she does like it. She doesn't understand why she likes it, but she does like it. And so there's at least a little bit of interest in him towards the beginning of the novel beyond just the case. Now, we understand, as we talked about last week, the case is the biggest reason why she's interested. Remember, we talked about last week that there's that moment where he says those key words about privacy. There's just like, she gets all of a sudden interested in his case. So that is mostly why she's interested, but she does admit she likes it. That, and it's actually probably a fairly nice critique of the novel, is that she doesn't really develop that love interest. She just kind of becomes a love interest at some point, and yeah, there's no emotional growth in her. A lot of interaction with her. It just kind of very quickly happens. So I think that's a very astute point there. In a food person. So back to chapter 6. This is where George finally says on page 74, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. And he's kind of frantically going through this, like, I need to figure this out. because he now understands that Haber is using him to change things and thus really doesn't intend to cure him. Now, we'll get to what this definition of cure means. But as I mentioned earlier, we said we're going to mention mad scientists, and that's because George mentions mad scientists on page 75. And he says, but he's not a mad scientist, Thor thought dully. He's a pretty sane one, or he was. And so we get this idea of what constitutes a mad scientist. Like, do you have to be insane? Or do you have to have nefarious purposes? Can you be a mad scientist if you really intend good? You could also argue that all mad scientists, at least most of the ones I can think of off the top of my head, intended some good, even going all the way back to Dr. Frankenstein. There was an intent for something good there. And so this question of sanity obviously kind of goes through the entire book, since we're dealing with the patient psychologist of who is really the insane one. We'll deal again with George and his level of sanity later. But at least at this point, Orr is sane. He believes he's doing this right. He's being very logical. We have a problem. We need to fix it. Here's an obvious solution. Let's use it. And so it goes on and through chapter 6, and George, we have him, I would like to meet Heather. Like, there's this Monday for lunch that they set up that never happens, and we figure out why later. And then we get to this confrontation. We get an explanation of the crash a little bit with the carcinomic plague. And kind of the air and kind of what comes there. So we get lots of description here too. And then we get this confrontation between Orr and Haber, where George says, please stop using my dreams to improve things, Dr. Haber. It won't work. It's wrong. I want to be cured. And we get back to that concept of cure. What does cure mean? Obviously, the cure would be very simple. I don't dream effectively anymore. But Haber doesn't actually respond to what he says. He's like, that's the one essential prerequisite to your cure, George, wanting it. And so Haber completely ignores what he's saying. Now, this isn't the first time Haber's completely ignored George. Haber really just kind of disregards George's own will, and kind of from the very first time they met, to instituting his own will on top of what George wants. And George does respond, you're not answering me, but Haber continues on and really bears no witness to that, what he said or his intent or that. And then they get into this philosophical discussion. Someone just asked a question. Hello, I wanted to ask if Dr. Haber fully or consciously acknowledges the control he has or the changes he's making, or does he still think Orr is delusional? Oh, I think at this point, it's pretty clear that Ursula has made it clear in the novel that Haber knows what he's doing. Now, you'll notice periodically, reality change, Haber does kind of fill in some of the gaps to complete the story to make it make sense, much as our brain naturally does that. Anytime we have kind of disjointed memories or recollections, that we kind of fill in the gaps, right? Later on, we'll have both George and Heather frustrated with this multiple versions of memories and realities in your head. Haber kind of fills in stories periodically. But yes, I think by the time we get to this session with Heather observing at the end of chapter 5, he is very conscious of what he is doing and the control he is exerting on the world and on George. Now, that's the other reason kind of the first 5 chapters are very important, is Haber's ego is essential to kind of understanding this one. He believes he knows what's right. He believes he is smarter than George and others. He believes his intent is also good as well, which negates any guilt about having George dream 6 billion people off the planet. I would also say that as you go through chapter 6 to 11, you also get a feeling from Haber that It's George doing this. I'm merely pointing him in the right direction, which allows Haber to kind of remove some of that guilt. And of course, this is something George and Heather later on will deal with. This is the guilt of, am I doing it? Is Haber doing it? Am I responsible for what's being done? And of course, later we'll talk about Heather and George have that conversation. So, but during this conversation, George says, "You speak as if that were some kind of general moral imperative." I'm sorry, this Haber speaking. He looked at Orr with his genial, reflective smile, stroking his beard. But in fact, isn't that man's very purpose on earth? To do things, change things, run things, make a better world? And George responds with, no. Haber asks, what is his purpose then? And George responds, honestly, I don't know. Things don't have purposes, as if the universe were a machine where every part has a useful function. And so this argument about what is man's purpose is use on this planet, and George is arguing it doesn't have one. Now, things don't have purposes, they just are. And Haber's like, no, we have a purpose. We are the masters of our domain, and if we can make things better, we should. And so herein we get the very philosophical question of what is man's purpose, which is quite fascinating in this novel. Yes, very good in the chat there. Yes, I've noticed he mentions what has Orr done. Yes, it's always what Orr is, not what he's done. Really, he's just providing a suggestion. When in reality, he's the one in control. It's his machine that's allowing this to happen on command, and it's his hypnotic suggestions that are doing this. So we get this question of what is his purpose, his being humanity's purpose, with specifically Orr. You know, and later we get several analogies that that the Doctor tries to present to Orr and try to kind of justify all this. But it does come down to this philosophical question of what is our purpose on this planet? And is it to change? Is it always to make things better? So something to think about as you're going through this. More, let's see, other questions in the chat. Someone's suggesting that there's a split in his consciousness in two. I don't know that I would call it a split in consciousness. I would say it's probably more justification more than anything. Now later, looking ahead to chapter 11, we find out what eventually happens to the good doctor. But I don't know if this splits consciousness. I would say, because even when Heather and Orr are dealing with their, what they call basically two tracks, one set of wheels, it's not a split consciousness. You are fully functioning in what you're doing, and you're just trying to deal with two sets of facts. But notice that his ego is always present, regardless of what train of thought we're in. This idea that I can make things better, I can fix things always. And so this confrontation continues. We get this idea of the ends justifies the means, right? And then we go back into this hypnotic state for George, where we're obviously going to change things again. And so moving on through chapter 6, we get to the very end of chapter 6 there. And George tells him, I am cracking, he said. You must see that. You're a psychiatrist. Don't you see that I'm going to pieces? Aliens from outer space attacking Earth? Look, if you ask me to dream again, what will you get? Maybe a totally insane world, the product of an insane mind. Monsters, ghosts, witches, dragons, transformations, all the stuff we carry around in us. All the horrors of childhood, the night fears, the nightmares. How can you keep all that from getting loose? I can't stop it. I'm not in control. And so this is George's anxiety here. It's like, there's no control in my brain. It just as all of us, we can't control what we dream, right? And imagine our dreams being able to change reality when we can't even control them. We're not even generally conscious of our dreams. And Haber responds with his ego firmly intact. Don't worry about control. Freedom is what you're working toward, Haber said gustily. Freedom! Your unconscious mind is not a sink of horror and depravity. That's a Victorian notion, and a terrifically destructive one. It crippled most of the best minds of the 19th century and hamstrung psychology all through the first half of the 20th. Don't be afraid of your unconscious mind. It's not a black pit of nightmares. Nothing but mind. It is the wellspring of health, imagination, and creativity. What we call evil is produced by civilization. Its constraints and repressions to form in a spontaneous, free self-expression of the personality. So we get this basically saying, no, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. At the core of this is all just creativity and wonder and free self-expression. That the darkness in us is a creation of civilization, not within us. And so again, we get this, and that's essentially is what chapter 6 is. It's a lot of it is just philosophical argument between Moore and the good doctor. And here we get the conversation about, is man dark and repressed and evil kind of inside, or kind of all the nightmares that fuel us, or is he free thinking and wonderful? Another question came up. Do you think it was right for Orr and Lalash to try and change things back? For example, the aliens are gone for the moon, and then we'll get to that next chapter. So there, it's and to a certain extent, it is a question of, do you always just let things happen, or if you have the power to change them, do you? Again, we get into that philosophical discussion. In a way, it goes against what Orr stands for, because now a new reality has been made. Yeah, we're going to change, but remember, all really Orr wanted was, and we'll get to this in the next chapter, Orr wanted was Haber to stop. He didn't ask her to change. That was Heather's idea. Heather had in that moment of well, I could change this. I could get rid of the aliens off me. And that's why poorly worded requests or wishes and many fairy tales never end well. All right, let's take a look at chapter 7. In chapter 7, Heather searches for Orr. We get this very long intro from Victor Hugo that, again, yes, is fair game for the test. And so we get it from Heather's perspective. She gets up, she goes to meet, he doesn't show, and then she tries to figure out, all right, how do I track him down? How do I find him? Because he has basically just disappeared. He's not at work. He's not at work, not at the home. One of the interesting things that I hope you're noticing about Heather is the animal and noise references. We get some right here at the beginning. Animal and noise references, click, clack, prey, web. She's called a Black Widow again. That happens very often in the beginning of the book, less so towards the end, which is interesting. But eventually she tracks him down. And then she finds him in his cabin and says, are you ill? He obviously looks distressed. He looks like he's out here in the middle of nowhere. And she comes in and finds out that he can't sleep. And there's an interesting moment here that happens on page 96. If you have the book with the blue and orange bottom cover with the turtle, it's page 96. And he says to her, I haven't been in my right mind. Saying that to himself again, despite his lunatic hair and eyes, a man whose personal dignity went to sleep has to be nearly invisible. And she says, it's all right, I don't care, but you're skipping therapy, aren't you? She says, yes. And I guess maybe I've marked on something. But anyway, at some point in this chapter, she talks about what struck her most was his strength. And that's an interesting point there in chapter 7, because if you'll remember back from the very first chapter where Heather and George meet, she doesn't think he's strong at all. She thinks he's quite weak. it, and so that's something to kind of think about in the relationship. There's a certain element of change in the relationship at this point once in the cabin. Someone just commented on there that the beastly ways often talk about dominance and submissiveness and predatory body language. Yeah, that's because I think that what that does is it sets up the weakness of George. It forces us to think of George as prey, as someone that's basically being toyed with by two people, the doctor and Heather, at least initially, that he's being used like prey, like food. And so that's, I think, the impression, and it's why it falls away, why those references generally fall away the farther we get in the book, is because Heather then becomes an ally at that point. She's no longer, using him. Uh, they actually need each other. She needs him for existence at one point, which we'll get to in a minute. So this idea that she is beginning to see him differently, even though the scene starts with "Are you ill?" like seeing him in distress, it slowly progresses to that she sees his strength, and so we get also her comment about running, which I mentioned earlier, is this running on two tracks with one set of wheels. This idea of that people still have memories and we react to memories from different timelines, which I imagine to be very confusing. This will become even more extreme as we go through the book. George will have to deal with this about not remembering where buildings are or where restaurants are later. Heather not remembering, like she runs into a wall at home, like there wasn't a wall there last time. And of course, Haber will have the worst element of this with later on in the book. And then later on, through this conversation where they are talking about the situation that they are in, and kind of how Haber is playing a role in here. On page 101, Heather's talking to him, and she says, "It is an invasion of privacy, but it won't make the case. Listen, what if you had a dream where you changed him?" And this is where it's what Orr wants. He wants him to stop, but it is Heather's idea that what if you dreamed effectively? That Haber stopped, just didn't do anything. Seems like a fairly simple solution. Now, simple is hard with dreams because who knows how that's going to make its way into reality through the dream world, that you literally could possibly kill Haber. Much like or killed his aunt, right? Just, I want you to go away, and then she dies in a car accident. So there is some danger in this. And if we were to think back to some of Orr's other dreams, we understand that there's danger in this, but we also understand that there really is no imperative that he do this. But it's still interesting that she talks about it in the sense of it's an invasion of privacy. In the sense of that you are invading your dreams, you're invading other people's reality, you're changing other people's reality. That is probably the ultimate invasion of privacy, that you're changing the very nature of our lives. And then we get the big reveal. The big reveal that this is not the biggest thing that George has done. And he asks her, as we're going through this, do you remember, this is on page 105, do you remember anything about 4 years ago in 98? April? No. Nothing special. Well, that's when the world ended, he said. A muscular spasm disfigured his face, and he gulped his for air. Nobody else remembers. But obviously he does. And so he tells her the story that the world ended, or world was about to end, and I dreamed it back right. Which gets into this whole discussion with Heather, like, well, see, like, you saved something. Like, that may have been what was supposed to happen. And she tells him a little later on page 107, so what? Maybe that's all it's ever been. Whatever it is, it's all right. You don't suppose you'd be allowed to do anything you weren't supposed to do. And again, so she's assuming that there's some intelligent design behind everything, whereas George keeps trying to tell everyone, like, no, I don't think there is. I just think it kind of happens. So maybe we should be a little more worried about this. And so again, they decide, okay, Heather's going to hypnotize him. She has some very shaky credentials for hypnotism. And Okay, great. We're going to make it work. And she's like, okay, great. Dr. Hager, he's going to be nice to you. He's going to help you. He's going to be great. And then all of a sudden, she decides to take one more step. One more step. Like, well, I could fix things. And essentially, for a moment, Heather tastes a little bit of what Hager is going to taste. It's like, oh, I could fix this, but I could also fix something else. I could get rid of the aliens. And she decides the very poorly worded, uh, the aliens aren't out there on the moon any longer. She just said aliens go back home to never to return. Any other phrasing of that probably would have worked out just fine. Um, why does the author, when it's asked about the chapter, why does the author focus on the sound of the river so much? I think there's an element of sound that kind of goes with Heather first off, that sound is kind of ever present with her. Um, and that's probably a longer, deeper discussion than we have time for tonight. There's also this idea of water that she'll notice kind of flows, no pun intended, flows in and out of the novel throughout. And so I think this is just another water reference. It's one element of, or one analogy often used for our reality is a river, right? That it flows in one direction and it's definite and moves, and whereas at the beginning of the book we get the ocean where the jellyfish is kind of aimlessly floating back and forth with no real one sense of direction, other than the rocks later. And then of course at the very end of the book we'll get mist, which is basically this atomized air, or water, excuse me, that has no flow really to it, maybe currents in it. So I think you've got a lot of things going in there with water imagery. Why was there the image of screaming children? Remind me what page that is on, Aria. The screaming children. Was it in chapter 7? It's not ringing a bell right off the top of my head. While waiting on Aria to tell me where the screaming children are. See if there are other questions. Tried to change things back. He doesn't want to change anything at all. It's Heather to want to change things. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Heather was just making a small change. Like she just had a fear of the aliens up on the moon. It's like, oh, I'll just get rid of it. Again, it's the same road that Haber eventually goes down. If you find the page, Aria, I'll look and I'll give you some more insight into the Screaming Children. I just don't remember it off the top of my head. All right, let's go ahead and move on to chapter 8. So chapter 8 is where the aliens attack, and then we get the big confrontation between Haber and George right in the middle of the invasion, right? And so we start off with, first off, an interesting little note about the Second World War, and I wonder how many of you actually knew that already for there, that the only direct attack was on the state of Oregon. As far as actual United States at the time, the Alaska, there was some fighting and whatnot in Alaska, but that wasn't actually part of the United States. Yeah, it was still just territory. It wasn't its actual state. And so we start with that, and that's something, again, and trying to point out also places where that might make good multiple choice questions. That might make one. Maybe for a nice super quiz question up there on the board. And so we get this explanation of the alien invasion and the chaos that kind of ensues from it. And the way the humans respond, the way Earth responds, the nuclear weapons going off, most of them are being turned back on to Earth and aren't really doing any damage to the aliens. And then we get this interesting scene with Haber, who is going to his office against all the crowds. Imagine an alien invasion. Everyone tries to leave downtown, right? Haber's going towards downtown. So he's got to get to his building there. And he says, or in his head, that had been distressing. He did not like crowds, but then the crowds had ceased, and he was left walking all alone in the vast expanses of lawn and grove and forest in the park, and that was a great deal worse. This idea that he was alone was worse than crowds, even though he didn't like crowds. And there's some it's an interesting moment for Haber throughout this chapter where we do get some introspection from him, or a little bit from his perspective. But yet, as soon as we get back with George, the ego comes back, and it's part of the book that I'm like, I just don't feel like Haber is developed far enough, or probably as much as he should have been. There are moments of this, but not as much as I think for us truly to understand Haber more deeply, other than just your standard. Um, Forgive the Marvel reference again, the Thanos reference of I just want to fix things the way I think it should be fixed, and I don't really care who gets hurt. Like, I think there's something probably more deep to Haber than just that. And so we get, or finally reaches the building, um, and he asks, like, "Is this real, or is this?" And or tells him, "No, I dreamed it. This is something I dreamed." And so, well, Haber jumps into actions. Is great. We can fix this easy. Hop in the old augmenter. Let me hook you up. Things are exploding all around. I'm not sure exactly how you hypnotize somebody with things exploding around and alien invasion going on, but hey, whatever works. Or is pretty susceptible to hypnosis, and so gets him under, gets the dream in there that they come in peace. And then, of course, the alien shows up, blows out the window, comes out of the ship. Haber's hiding, blocking the augmenter from damage, although he has no real power to stop it. And the alien reaches out to him and gives him the golden rule, right? Like, where's the fact here? Yes. It says he faces death. A flat, toneless voice came out of the elbow joint. Do not do to others what you wish others not to do to you. And at that point, we find out that this is a peaceful arrival. And we assume at that point, at least in this part of chapter 8, that this is Orr's dream come to fruition. Like, that no, this is peaceful, where there is no war, there is never war. It was all a big misunderstanding. And he says, please inform others that this is peaceful arrival. We do not have any weapons. Great self-destruction follows upon unfounded fear. Please cease destruction of self and others. We do not have any weapons. We are non-aggressive, unfighting species. And so again, Orr changes things. And of course, this one's great. Okay, great. It's not an alien invasion. It's not going to be an alien war. Thanks, Harley, for reference. As soon as I'm done with chapter 8, I'll go back and take a look at that. And so we get this, Orr wakes up, alien leaves, Orr wakes up. It's like, yeah, we need to inform people. They'll be looking for explanations. Is there somebody in government you might call? Maybe the Hugh minister. And Haber has created a timeline for himself where he is this bigwig in government there. And so, yes, you can call. The fact that if you were just a lowly doctor, you would not be able to call anybody, but you're a big doctor there. And so, is that okay? Great. But then we get this conversation again. Again, going back to the philosophical argument of chapter 6, where Haber says, why didn't you put us over in another continuum where the mess simply never happened? It would be a lot easier. Nobody would be dead. Why didn't you simply get rid of the aliens? And Orr says, I don't choose. Don't you see that? I follow. And again, this statement here tracks back to everything that we've been told about Orr since the very beginning, right? Haber's observation, Haber's observation. This is a person who has no real strength, except for Heather later recognizes that strength. But we're told, like, he's just kind of milquetoast. He's just, this is not a man of action. I follow. And then Haber says, you follow my hypnotic suggestions, yes, but never fully, never directly and simply. And Orr responds, I didn't mean those. Orr said. but ran to his personal secretary who was now in the line while Haber was talking or slipped away downstairs, no doubt, to see about the woman. And so we never really get a full understanding of what or means what he says. I didn't mean those. I follow. But he's not talking about the hypnotic suggestions. Any thoughts on what he may have been talking about? What, who, or is he following? And Arya, let's see. So she shut the door on the voices of the unborn children singing in the water and turned to a small warm room and the sleeping man. Arya, I'm not exactly sure. I'll do some work before next week and come back next week and I'll have an answer for you. I will dig down into that passage and pick it apart a bit for you. So sorry I can't do it on the um, fly like that, but I will. I've got a PDF of it. I will do a search for that passage for you and really pick it apart for you. Um, or maybe I'll just post it on social media. So keep an eye on social media, and I will personally give you a post with an explanation there. Haber calls his subconscious broken. Yes. Later on, though, we're going to find out something else about that kind of disproves that. But yeah, I would spend some time thinking about what Orr means by what he's following. I follow. Or is there anything he's following? Is it just I follow? All right, let's take a look at chapter 9. Chapter 9, George and Haber Changing World. This one is a little bit of a flashback. We get some filled in elements of what happened before the alien invasion, and then it goes back to after the alien invasion about how he changes the world. Haber talks about we get the kind of the World Planning Center. We now know that Haber has changed this to basically Portland's the capital of the planet now. By the way, on page 128 is a perfect reason why you never start a sentence with the word it. Portland was, as the souvenir postcard said, the capital of the planet. Its population was 2 million. 2 million population of the planet or 2 million population of Portland? It's not exactly clear. Obviously, it's pretty obvious you're talking about Portland, but still, don't start sentences with it. I read that and it's like, editor needed to fix that there. And so we get all the elements of this new world where Haber is kind of the center of all things. We get more discussion about Heather. And then we find out one of the big changes that Haber was made is that race no longer exists. That now everyone is gray. And we find out that because everyone is gray, that Heather no longer exists. Because Heather, according to Orr, part of her existence was her color and the experiences that because we get introduced to how her parents met, right? He was a civil rights activist. She was someone working, I believe, with the ACLU, and that's how they met. And so without the race issue, they never meet. So Heather doesn't exist. We also learned that yes, there's no South Africa issue. There was never any segregation, but there's no Martin Luther King now. There's no Lincoln. There's no Gettysburg Address, etc. And so, interesting enough, later I do notice that there's still President Eisenhower. So I'm still wondering, like World War II, if that's still like what was the issue of World War II? But yeah, it's. I don't expect again to answer every possible historical thing. It might have changed a little bit. So, but still, it did make me wonder. And then on page 131, we get this great line. It's really about how. Now, probably most of you have been in a history English class about, right? The absolute power. That's the quote I'm looking for here. Um, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And on page 131, the quality of the will to power is precisely growth. Achievement is its cancellation. To be, the will to power must increase with each fulfillment, making the fulfillment only a step to a further one. The faster the power gained, the vaster the appetite for more. As there was no visible limit to the power Haber wielded through ore streams, so there was no end to his determination to improve the world. And this is where we begin to truly see in chapters 9 and 10 the true evil that comes about as Haber is trying to improve and improve and improve. It kind of lends itself to that other kind of old cliche saying, the more you try to make a place like heaven, the more you make it like hell, right? We find out about the violence and the euthanasia very soon after, pages I think 132 where citizen arrest. Citizen has basically euthanasia on their hip. If they notice someone who has evaded, who has an illness, that they can just kill them right there with witnesses. That there's violent. It's not really sports, but exhibitions of blood. We get this phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Basically, if you are in the minority or if you are uh, outside of the majority, that we're not concerned about what's good for you. We're only concerned about the greatest good for the greatest number, and that really has been Haber's motto throughout. So it's not unusual that that phrase becomes kind of the core element of this new society that Haber has created with the augmenter and Ore. Is that, okay, great, 6 billion people got dreamed off the planet, but everyone that left here is much better off. Um, and then we get the next thing, which is kind of the questions about George's sanity and the questions about who George is and everything else. Haber finally tells him, like, hey, we did a bunch of tests on you when you first got here. And you were what we call perfectly normal. Like you were right dab in the middle of everything. Intelligence, extroversion, introversion score, everything is right there in the middle. You are as perfectly sane as possible. You are so sane, he says on page 137, as to be an anomaly. Like no one is this sane. No one is this perfectly sane. And it's all of us who run around the world every day. We can all agree that no one is absolutely perfectly sane. We're all a little off kilter one way or the other. Now, the other interesting thing at the end of chapter 9 that we get is we find out what Haber's actual ultimate plan is. That is that he is going to be the one to dream and change things, that he's going to figure out by analyzing George's readings and waves to be able to recreate that in himself so that he could do it and just take Ore out of the picture altogether. Because remember, Haber's constantly thinks, well, the reason things don't work out is because Ore is resisting me. In fact, he says that, I believe, at one point in this chapter, like, you're always resisting me. You're always kind of, everything I ask you to do, you're always just a little off. If I control it, again, going back to Haber's ego that we were introduced in the very in the second chapter, he believes I can control this. I can do it. Of course, what he fails to realize is that he is not perfectly sane and normal the way George is, so results may not be the same. All right, moving on. Chapters 10 and 11, last two chapters of the book. Heather returns and the fracture. Here is where we find out at the end of chapter 9, Ore and Haber kind of leave each other, and it's like, yeah, I'll be back tomorrow. And we get, at the beginning of chapter 10, we get Ore's perspective. We start getting introduced to the fact how many different fractures are actually in his head. Like how many different timelines that he's experienced. He talks about all the various jobs he's had. each time things change. Usually I end up being a draftsman. Now I'm in the office of the Parks Department, which I kind of hate. So I don't like that. Um, and then we get him walking into the alien junk store with one of the aliens who runs it with a bunch of old things, peacock feathers, a home movie projector, Mad magazines. Probably none of you know what Mad magazine was, but it was an old kind of jokey, funny magazine that I don't believe is in print anymore. Um, and we get a little bit of a conversation with the alien. He asks them about this IFLU concept that were introduced earlier, which is a concept you should absolutely uh, kind of make note of every time it pops up in the book. And again, the alien, just as the previous alien told him, it's like, I can't communicate in language, sorry. Um, no, he asks about the lash, Heather. Um, alien gives us some phrases that, like, maybe he knows what's going on. Um, I, on page 155, uh, he does say something interesting, which when I first introduced the aliens last week, I said, they're basically a creation of George, so their characteristics are going to kind of flow from George. But he says, after all, he thought as he walked on toward Corbin Avenue. Surprisingly, the aliens are on my side. In a sense, I invented them. I have no idea in what sense, of course, but they definitely weren't around until I dreamed they were, and until I let them be, so that there always was, a connection between us. And so he recognizes that, yeah. And obviously, one of the things that probably should make a little flashcard or make a note of is what record that and who the record is by that the alien gives them. With a little help from my friends, maybe pop that on if you're finished reading the book. It's a good one. And it's a gift from the alien. So at that point, and once you get a little farther in, with a little help from my friends, when he plays it when he goes to sleep, then we start getting an inkling that yes, the alien was helping him in a very subtle way. Um, it, Someone in the chat just asked, what's the importance of the alien words? What do they mean to Orr, since he is the one who essentially created them? I think the way this is written, I would generally read these as they're meant to be confusing. They're meant to be as confusing to you as they are to Orr. And only once you're kind of done with the novel and you've seen everything that happens are you able to really go back and place some meaning into them. In a sense, they're kind of like dreams. Like, you're not exactly sure, because they are a product of dreams. You're not exactly sure what they mean, but maybe later on with some introspection and all of it's kind of put together, you can kind of put some meaning on them. But really, you're putting meaning on them. I don't know that there's any meaning within it. So it's kind of a, yeah, I think they're kind of intended to be that way. As someone who also writes like this, that's probably what I would be doing if this, if I'd written this. That you want them to be confusing, you want Orr to be confused with them, you want you to be confused with them as well, but also them to find little bits of meaning in them later once everything kind of flows out. That's kind of what I took from it. So, and so with the record playing, he goes to sleep, and then all of a sudden, Heather's back. And we get a little bit from her perspective, and this idea that basically she wasn't, but now she is again. And so it is kind of like she's been asleep for a very long time, that she's not quite sure what's real and like what's, and it's, yeah. So Heather's back. They're married now. Like, not only did he bring her back as his friend, but as his wife. He basically fast forwarded through the romantic relationship they never saw, to where she is his wife. We could have our own little philosophical discussion about that, and whether that's even like that feels really manipulative as well on his part. But again, he can't control his dreams. All he did was go to sleep, play the record, and going back to Heather's point, maybe that's what was supposed to happen. If you're not in control, maybe someone is making this happen or letting this happen. And so, you can get into your philosophical discussion of that. All right, then we get the last session at Hira. One of the interesting things that we get in this chapter is Huron, and we also get the what it means, and it stands for Human Utility Research and Development. So at the very core, once we get to this last section, basically Haber is at the head of this Huron, this human utility, basically using human as tools, using them, finding a purpose for them, a use for them. Which is kind of the culmination of kind of everything this novel has been working for to that end. Haber is celebrating at this point because this is the last session. He's figured it all out. Next step, put the augmenter on him, click the button, and start changing the world to whatever he wants. Someone just asked, can I ask why Orr continues going back to Dr. Haber? Is there a symbolic meaning to this? I don't think there's a symbolic meaning to this. I think, first off, the novel pretty much sets up that he really has no choice. He can choose prison, or an insane asylum, or therapy. He continuously hopes that Haber might cure him or figure out how this to stop. Now, at a certain point, that he pretty much gives that up. So that's not even a possibility that Haber is ever going to stop. But he is kind of stuck. And it also kind of lends itself to Haber's expression of, like, I follow. Like, I just do. And this is one of the things he just does. So he's kind of trapped. There's not much. I mean, it's just you need, and also just for a simple narrative thing, you need him to keep going back. I mean, and at one point where he stops going back, he won't let himself sleep. So that's essentially going to just stop going back and he'll sleep. Well, he can't do that, so he'll die. So it's he's kind of in a catch-22. So we'll get to your question about to the impatience of constantly fearing him in the next chapter there. So, and so we get it to where we're going with this, Heather accompanies, like, oh, your husband's going to be cured. Great. Or asks even Haber, like, hey, do you know the term aku? And Haber says, yeah, I heard it. It's untranslated. You decided it means dreams, hey? Dor says, I don't know what it means. I don't pretend to have any knowledge you haven't got. But I do think that before you go on with the application of the new technique, Dr. Haber, before you dream, you ought to talk with one of the aliens. Which one? The flick of irony was clear. Anyone. It doesn't matter. Talk about what, George? About me. About dreaming. About aku. It doesn't matter so long as you listen. You'll know what you're getting at. They're a lot more experienced than we are at all this. At what? At dreaming. At what dreaming is an aspect of. They've done it for a long time. For always, I guess. They are of the dream time. I don't understand it. I can't say it in words. Everything dreams. So they are a creation of the dreams. And so perhaps that they would understand everything a little bit better because they are of the dreams. They are created out of dreams. And so obviously Orr got some wisdom and some knowledge out of his conversations with the aliens, and he's hoping that Haber will too. But of course we know from Haber's ego that is not going to happen. The session happens. Haber has some dreams that he will no longer dream effectively, which he could have done from the very beginning. And because the mystery is solved, he's figured this out. He has the waves, he has the charts, he has the machine, he has everything he needs. And Orr and Heather decide to go eat out. They've saved up their ration cards. But then Orr, after they've left, decides, I've got to go back. And that is where we get the big confrontation where Haber is in the machine and Orr hits the button to stop it. And everything kind of crashes and burns at that point. And that brings us to chapter 11, the aftermath, where we kind of see what has happened with the world afterwards. And interesting enough, Haber has ended up in the federal asylum. Now, someone asked, like, why are the inpatients all scared of him? And I think that's part of it, that he changed things, that his brain is kind of is off kilter, that they can sense it. That's kind of a pretty typical trope in sci-fi and horror or anything like that, is that mentally disturbed people uh, or people with mental illness can somehow sense things that the rest of the people can't. They are attuned with a different wavelength of life that the rest of us aren't, and so I think that is kind of what it's meant to speak to. Um, but all that change, that big crash, the fracture through like multiple timelines against multiple timelines, we have bridges that just end, we have trains that just end, we have people thrown into different timelines that they have no conception of. It's all just a jumble of everything that George had done prior to that. But of course, no Heather. He can't find her. But then, because things are supposed to end the way they're supposed to end, she walks into the shop that he lives in, or he works in. And she asks, he sees her, she sees him, and asks, when did I know you? Because everyone's kind of gotten used to, like, oh, there's multiple things that I've existed in, and like, because they're all these various fractured realities. And she asks, when did I know you? And they begin talking. And they talk about who George is, and where she is now, what she does. And then George asks her, would you like to go get a coffee? The alien says, yes, go, fine. The alien says, take evening. There is time. There are returns. To go is to return. Or thanks him. The alien waves. And the alien watched from them within the glass-fronted shop, as a sea creature might watch from an aquarium, seeing them pass and disappear into the mist. And so we end with the mist, just as we started with the ocean, and we have the river throughout. Actually, the river appears quite often in there, where George and Heather are together, the dreams are gone, and everything is resolved. So let's take a look at some of the questions that are out there. Why was it different when Haber dreamed versus when Orr dreamed? I think the key, it's put into the book, and the book doesn't completely explain this, but I think it is Haber's explanation of Orr's psychiatric results, all the tests that were done on him. The fact that he is perfectly normal, that he is no one way or the other, perfectly sane, he is a brain unlike any other human, that allowed him to dream naturally and to change things naturally. With Haber's disorganized, egotistical, and already fractured kind of mind, maybe he wasn't perfectly sane the way Haber was, or excuse me, Orr was. That didn't work. Okay. Remember, all the augmenter did was allow Orr to do it immediately and to measure it. So what Orr was doing was natural. What Haber is doing is unnatural. It's as natural as changing realities for dreams can be. So I think that's why it just doesn't work with Haber. And that again is another trope in sci-fi, that what works naturally one way, once a scientist starts trying to mess with it and do it unnaturally, to do it with technology, to do it on its own, it screws everything up because you have violated the laws of nature, right? And in this sense, in this book, in this reality, part of nature is Haber's ability to change, or excuse me, Orr's ability to change reality. It is unnatural for Haber to do it. So I think that's why. Why was it Haber was able to know about April in '84? Cause or mention the truth about April 4 when the world ended? Was it because once you effectively dream, you know all the memories? I don't remember catching that Haber knew about the end of the world, unless Orr told him at some point. I don't, I don't remember him telling him at some point, and I don't remember Haber recognize it. I'm just confused about why Haber could change everything to how it was before he even knew of the dreams, how he knew from before the double memories. Well, if you'll remember, if we'll go back, Haber only recognizes things change with the portrait or the mural that's on the wall. I don't believe he knew about anything about what Haber, because I think Heather is the one he told about the end of the world. From my recollection of the book, having read it, I think 3 times now. Um, but if not, let me know. Let me know page number, and I'll be happy to go look at that. 'Cause I don't think he does. Um, and so the fracture that occurs is really a fracture of all the times that Orr has changed the world, not uh, Haber. Because again, we're messing with the natural change that happened with an unnatural change. What do you think the scene in chapter 1 signified? Uh, oh, um, the ocean kind of moving, the jellyfish. I think the jellyfish is George. I think he is someone that is kind of drifting in kind of the currents, um, and is not really in control. And think about a jellyfish. Jellyfish just kind of floats, right? There's no real direction. I don't know if that's true, but at least in this analogy that in Lathe of Heaven, basically the jellyfish just floats. Um, they may swim. For those of you who know more about jellyfish, you guys know in the chat they actually swim, but it just floats. And so that essentially is George. And so we get kind of it's basically a metaphor for George, but it's also kind of that dream state that George is in when he's all kind of on these drugs. So it kind of serves as two purposes. And then with the rocks being reality, the crashing of the rocks of reality, and then also him waking up is also that crashing of reality back into his life. Page 180 is there. So let me take a look at page 180 for those of you asking about knowing about there. So don't remember that. Me looking at a book is probably not really YouTube live content, but still. Uh, okay. Dr. Haber said, but his voice failed. He felt excruciating pity and fear. He knew what Haber was looking at. He had seen it himself. He was looking at the world after April 1988. He was looking at a world as misunderstood by the mind, a bad dream. I'm guessing that's not really well explained. You're right. I didn't catch that when the multiple times I've read this. Um, my interpretation of it would be that, my guess would be that Haber gained access to all the realities that Haber had changed when he put himself in there using those brainwaves. Um, the only other explanation I can talk, if anybody else has a good explanation, I'd love to hear it. That he's terrified by, obviously, yeah, I'm perplexed on that one. I will do some more thinking and reading about that. He knew what Haber was looking at. It seems, yeah, I saw it. Let's see. The beginning of the chapter, Orr mentioned why Haber was stuck and insane. He said something about how Haber knew the truth of the horrors of April '84. Yeah, and I think between the machine, the dreaming, and the unnatural of all this, and the horror that he saw, so I'm guessing being in that machine gave him insight into all the different realities that George had fixed or changed. And to some degree, Heather's theory kind of works here. That George changes things when somebody else wants him to. I mean, we go back to his remember his initial memory, right? It's the ant who's being aggressive. It's self-defense to protect. We have the change of the end of the world, self-defense, protecting of the world, protecting of himself. So, yeah, I mean, kind of like Heather's theory about why he dreams and why it's okay. But obviously, Orr's never going to be able to deal with the guilt of that. So, um, yeah, I think Arya, you've got some good thoughts there as well. I thought it was because he changed the world so radically. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, again, all of them have trouble, Heather and or keeping track of multiple timelines in their brain. Maybe there were so many different tracks that Haber was exposed to that just drove him completely insane. Um, or changing the end of the world was 84, and Haber changing the bad dream was 98. Yeah, and here's going to be your biggest issue with this book is you're probably going to need a chart. I'm going to suggest all your teams find a nice big wall in the classroom or hallway, create a nice big chart with all the different timelines and what happened and how George changed them. Because keeping track of the different dates and timelines, everything else, it is going to be a challenge for when you're taking tests and what timeline. I would imagine for the people who are making this test, it's going to be a challenge to make sure that you word the questions correctly so that it's very clear what timeline we're talking about and at what point in the book it is talking about. It's probably pretty easy to mix up the dates there. So yeah, don't worry. It's pretty understandable with this book. Because they're all futuristic, but they're all the past for us. And there's lots of different timelines of things happening. So, yeah. So, good luck to all of you decathletes as you try to keep track of the different timelines and the different events and consequences of where Heather is in each of these timelines, where Orr is, what job Orr has in each of these timelines, what position Haber has in each one of these timelines. So it's probably a good thing that it's only 11 chapters because that really does help kind of keep everything focused at least a little bit. So, well, this has been about 15 minutes longer than I was expecting, but lots of good questions. I'm so glad all of you were here to participate. Call your friends, get them on the broadcast next Thursday, where we'll discuss Orwell and go deep into that short story. And bring your questions of that. Make sure you read it beforehand. But please make sure that you follow us on Twitter, and I'm also call it Twitter for a while, and Instagram. But also make sure you're following the main USAD sites as well, because USAD puts out a lot of information there and fun stuff there too. And don't be if you come up with another question, feel free to respond to a tweet or respond to an Instagram post and pose your questions there. I'll be happy to respond to them there as well too. I live and breathe literature these days as I'm working on my dissertation, and so this book is one of many that I'm kind of digging through. So hope everyone has a great night. Thank you.